Backstage at Madison Square Garden carried a different kind of silence that winter night. Not quiet, never quiet, but heavy. The air smelled of sawdust, warm electrical wiring, and cigarette smoke curling toward a ceiling no one ever looked at. It was December, and the city outside moved with that restless energy only New York knew, but inside the garden there was anticipation, thick and electric. 18,000 seats waited to be filled for a Christmas charity concert that promised comfort, tradition, and familiar voices. At the center of that expectation stood two men from very different roads. Bing Crosby was already a legend. By 1953, his voice had become synonymous with Christmas itself. When Americans decorated trees, they played his records. When families gathered around radios, it was his tone that wrapped around them like wool on a cold night. Calm, assured, perfectly measured. Bing did not merely sing songs, he defined seasons. And then there was Dean Martin, younger, rising fast, famous for his relaxed charm and that effortless persona people loved. To audiences, he was smooth and playful, a man who looked like he had never worried about anything a day in his life. But behind that stage smile was Dino Crocetti from Ohio, a son of immigrants who had learned early that performance could protect you from being misunderstood. They had never truly spoken before that afternoon. Dean arrived early for sound check, hat low over his brow, coat collar turned up against the cold. The garden was empty then, rows upon rows of red seats waiting like silent judges. On the stage sat Bing, alone, legs dangling over the edge, staring into the vastness of it. Dean hesitated before approaching. Legends, he had learned, were safest from a distance. "You must be Dean," Bing said without turning around. Dean smiled. "Yes, sir." Bing finally looked at him, eyes sharp but kind. "Drop the sir. Makes me feel older than I already am." They shook hands. Bing's grip was steady, firm without force, the grip of a man who knew exactly who he was in public, even if he wasn't always sure in private. "You nervous?" Bing asked. Dean exhaled. "Little." "Good," Bing replied. "Means you still care." They sat together at the edge of that enormous stage, two voices from different chapters of American music. For a few minutes, they talked about ordinary things, travel, schedules, the grind of rehearsals, but gradually the conversation drifted somewhere less rehearsed. "What did you grow up listening to?" Bing asked. Dean leaned back, thinking. "Italian songs mostly. My father sang around the house. And gospel." Bing turned. "Gospel?" "There was a church near where we lived. Sundays I'd stand outside and listen. Couldn't understand every word sometimes, but I understood the feeling." "What feeling?" "That somebody meant it." Bing studied him carefully. "You ever sing it?" "Not on stage," Dean answered. "Doesn't fit what people expect." Bing gave a slow smile. "What if expectations are overrated?" Dean laughed lightly. "Easy for you to say." "Is it?" Bing replied softly. There was something in the way he said it, something almost tired. For decades, Bing had embodied reassurance. But reassurance can become armor, and armor grows heavy. "What's your favorite gospel song?" Bing asked after a pause. Dean didn't hesitate. "His Eye is on the Sparrow." The name lingered between them. "Sing it tonight," Bing said. Dean blinked. "That's not in the program." "I know. They'll think I've lost my mind." "Or maybe," Bing replied, "they'll think you found it." Dean felt his pulse quicken. Singing gospel meant shedding the character. No wink, no charm, no protective distance. It meant stepping out without the safety net of image. "Why?" Dean asked quietly. "Because," Bing answered, eyes fixed on the empty seats, "sometimes the only way to remember who we are is to risk showing it." Dean looked at him differently then. Not as a legend, not as the voice of Christmas, but as a man who sounded like he was talking to himself. As the evening approached and the garden filled, the air shifted from rehearsal calm to performance electricity. The crowd buzzed with excitement. Families, veterans, children in pressed coats. Charity banners hung proudly, reminding everyone why they were there. The show began as planned. Choirs sang. Comedians warmed the room. Applause rolled like waves. When Bing stepped onto the stage, the reception was thunderous. He delivered exactly what the audience expected. Classic carols, polished notes, effortless warmth. The room swayed in collective nostalgia. Backstage, Dean listened, heart steady but mind racing. Was Bing serious? Would he truly call for the song? 40 minutes into his set, Bing finished a beloved Christmas standard. The applause lingered. Instead of moving directly to introduce Dean's scheduled act, Bing stepped back toward the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice calm but deeper than before, "tonight is about more than songs we know. It's about hope." The audience quieted. And sometimes hope sounds different than we expect. Dean felt his throat tighten. "I've asked a friend to sing something tonight that isn't on the program," Bing continued. "Something honest." Murmurs rippled through the garden. "Please welcome Dean Martin." Dean stepped into the spotlight. Applause greeted him warmly, but curiosity hovered in the air. Bing walked beside him and leaned toward the microphone. "Dean," he said gently, "sing the song from Ohio." The world narrowed. Dean glanced at Bing once more. There was no mockery in his eyes, no challenge for spectacle, only belief. The band stood uncertainly. But Bing gestured for them to step back. No arrangement, no orchestration, just a man and a microphone. Dean closed his eyes. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. No audience, no stage, no image. Then he began. "Why should I feel discouraged?" His voice was softer than usual, less polished. The garden grew still. The second line came steadier. By the time he reached the chorus, something shifted, not only in his tone but in the room itself. It was not a performance in the traditional sense. It was memory. It was gratitude. It was a boy outside a church window finding comfort in a melody. He sang all 3 verses without flourish. No dramatic gestures, just truth. When the final note faded, silence held the garden captive. It wasn't confusion, it was reverence. And in that silence, something inside Bing Crosby broke open. Then he stood just off stage, eyes glistening, not from sentimentality, but recognition. Recognition of vulnerability. Recognition of a kind of courage that fame often discourages. He walked back onto the stage before applause began. The audience, sensing the gravity of the moment, slowly rose to their feet. Bing placed a hand on Dean's shoulder. For the first time in years, he felt the pull to step outside his own carefully constructed image. And that was when the real story began. The applause that followed Dean's final note did not erupt immediately. It rose slowly, almost cautiously, as if the audience understood they had witnessed something fragile and did not want to disturb it. What had filled Madison Square Garden moments earlier was not merely admiration, but a shared recognition that something real had slipped through the usual spectacle of performance. Bing Crosby stood beside Dean Martin, his hand resting firmly yet gently on the younger man's shoulder, and for a brief second he seemed less like the most dependable voice in America and more like a father watching his son discover his own strength. The ovation built until the garden thundered, but Bing was not focused on the applause. He was focused on the tremor in his own chest, on the unexpected sting behind his eyes, on the realization that he had not felt that kind of honesty on stage in years. Bing stepped forward toward the microphone, waiting until the noise softened. When he finally spoke, his voice was not the polished instrument that had defined countless recordings. It carried something unguarded. He told the crowd that what they had just heard was courage, and he said it not as a compliment but as a confession. He admitted that in decades of performing, he had learned how to give people what they wanted with precision, how to shape every note so that it reassured rather than unsettled, how to create an atmosphere that felt safe and predictable. Yet watching Dean strip away the comfortable persona and sing from the core of memory had unsettled him in the best possible way. It reminded him of his own beginnings in Spokane, of church pews and a mother who believed deeply in something beyond applause. He spoke carefully, not dramatically, explaining that somewhere between the early radio days and the sold-out tours, he had begun to equate excellence with control and success with emotional distance. Dean's song had pierced that distance. The crowd listened in a silence more attentive than any applause. It was unusual in that era for a performer of Bing's stature to reveal uncertainty, and yet that was precisely what gave his words weight. He said that there were songs a person sings because they are popular, and there are songs a person sings because they are necessary, and sometimes the necessary ones are the ones we avoid the longest. He turned to Dean and said simply, "You reminded me tonight." The statement was brief, but its impact carried far beyond the stage lights. It was not about one gospel hymn, and it was about permission. Permission to acknowledge that behind every polished voice is a human being who began somewhere smaller and more fragile than fame would suggest. Without announcing it as a grand gesture, Bing asked the audience if they would allow him to share something equally personal. The orchestra members looked uncertain, but Bing motioned them back once more. He began to sing a hymn he remembered from childhood, his voice not reaching for perfection, but settling into sincerity. It was not as technically immaculate as his Christmas standards, yet it carried warmth that could not be manufactured. Dean stepped closer, harmonizing softly, not as a featured act, but as a companion. The two voices blended not in competition, but in conversation. And for several minutes, Madison Square Garden felt less like an arena and more like a gathering of neighbors sharing something sacred. Many in the audience later said they could not recall every lyric, but they remembered how it felt: steady, humble, and profoundly human. When the final note faded, no one rushed to break the silence. It lingered with dignity, as though applause would have been too abrupt a return to normalcy. Eventually, appreciation swelled again, yet even the cheers carried a different tone. Less about celebrity, more about gratitude. The remainder of the concert proceeded, other performers delivering their planned numbers with professionalism and grace, but the atmosphere had shifted. Something intangible had entered the room and refused to leave. Backstage, as the final curtain fell and the crowds began to file out into the cold December night, Bing and Dean sat in a dressing room that suddenly felt much smaller than the vast stage they had just shared. Dean admitted he had never felt so exposed, yet he also felt lighter. Bing confessed that hearing the hymn had stirred memories he had carefully set aside over the years, memories of doubt, of ambition, of compromises made for the sake of career. He explained that when one becomes a symbol, as he had become for Christmas and comfort, there is pressure to maintain the image at all costs. He had grown accustomed to delivering reassurance even when he himself felt uncertain. Tonight, however, uncertainty had not weakened him. It had connected him to thousands of people who understood vulnerability far better than perfection. Dean listened thoughtfully, recognizing in Bing's words a reflection of his own quiet fears about whether audiences loved the real man or only the crafted persona. They spoke about how fame magnifies everything, including insecurity. Both men acknowledged that success can sometimes encourage distance rather than closeness, turning authentic emotion into something rehearsed. Yet the experience that night suggested another possibility, that audiences were capable of embracing sincerity when it was offered without manipulation. The charity organizers later reported that donations had exceeded expectations, not because of spectacle, but because people felt moved to respond to something genuine. Neither Bing nor Dean claimed credit for that outcome. They understood it as a reminder that honesty resonates more deeply than polish when it is given freely. As they prepared to leave the garden, photographers waited in the corridor, eager for quotes. Bing offered only a simple line, saying that sometimes the best music happens when artists forget about expectations and remember where they came from. Dean nodded in agreement, choosing not to elaborate. The story would circulate in newspapers, framed in various ways, but for the two men, the significance lay not in headlines, but in the quiet recognition that something had shifted internally. They had discovered that courage is not always loud or rebellious. Sometimes it is as understated as singing a childhood hymn in front of thousands and allowing it to mean something. In the days that followed, both men returned to their respective schedules, recordings, appearances, travel, but neither could entirely shake the echo of that night. For Bing, it served as a gentle challenge to examine the balance between image and authenticity. For Dean, it affirmed that the parts of himself he once believed incompatible with his public persona were not liabilities, but strengths. The dare that had begun as a backstage suggestion had become a catalyst for reflection, a reminder that even legends benefit from moments that restore perspective. Long after the lights dimmed and the garden returned to ordinary programming, the memory of that shared vulnerability continued to resonate, not as a spectacle, but as a testament to what can happen when two accomplished performers choose sincerity over safety. In the weeks after that December night, and life did what it always does for men in the public eye. It moved forward without pausing for reflection. Interviews were scheduled, contracts were negotiated, flights were boarded before dawn. Yet beneath the steady rhythm of professional obligations, something quieter lingered in both Bing Crosby and Dean Martin, an awareness that a boundary had been crossed, not in scandal or spectacle, but in sincerity. The newspapers had covered the concert with polite fascination, some praising the unexpected gospel moment as heartfelt, others suggesting it strayed from the polished format audiences expected. But for the two men at the center of it, the headlines were peripheral. What mattered was the internal shift neither could ignore. Bing found himself revisiting memories he had long stored away behind professional discipline. And he thought about the earliest days of his career, when singing was less about market positioning and more about expression. In Spokane, before radio contracts and studio lights, music had simply been a way to connect, to family, to faith, to something larger than ambition. Success had come gradually, then suddenly, and with it came the subtle understanding that audiences favored consistency. The public did not want uncertainty from Bing Crosby. They wanted assurance. Over time, he had perfected that assurance, shaping it into an identity so seamless that even he sometimes forgot where performance ended and personhood began. Yet Dean's unguarded delivery in Madison Square Garden had unsettled that equilibrium. It reminded Bing that authenticity, though risky, carries a resonance that cannot be replicated through precision alone. Dean, and for his part, experienced a different but equally profound reflection. The persona he carried, the relaxed, unbothered charmer, had served him well. It had opened doors, charmed audiences, and provided a shield against scrutiny. But singing that hymn without irony or theatrical flourish had forced him to stand without that shield. He had not intended to make a statement. He had simply followed a dare that felt strangely necessary. In the quiet moments afterward, he realized that the vulnerability he had feared might alienate audiences had instead deepened their connection. Letters began arriving at his home from concert-goers who wrote not about his usual humor or style, but about how the gospel song had reminded them of their own childhoods, their own struggles, their own private faith. The realization that sincerity could bridge distances more effectively than performance stirred something steady inside him. One afternoon in early January, Dean received a small package delivered without fanfare. Inside was a simple acetate recording, accompanied by a handwritten note. Bing explained that he had returned to the studio alone, long after scheduled sessions had ended, and recorded a personal version of the same hymn Dean had sung that night. The recording was not intended for commercial release. It was an experiment in honesty. When Dean placed the record on his player and listened, he heard something different from the iconic voice that filled holiday albums. Bing's tone carried fragility, pauses that suggested reflection rather than control. It was not flawless, yet it was deeply human. Dean understood immediately that this recording represented something far greater than a musical exercise. It was evidence that the dare had not been one-sided. Both men had stepped beyond their comfort. They spoke on the telephone later that evening, the conversation unhurried and candid. Bing admitted that making the recording had felt both liberating and unsettling. He confessed that he hesitated to share it publicly, concerned that audiences accustomed to polished perfection might misinterpret vulnerability as weakness. Dean encouraged him gently, suggesting that listeners are often more receptive to honesty than artists assume. Their exchange was not grand or dramatic. It was two seasoned professionals acknowledging a truth they had glimpsed together, that authenticity carries risk, but it also carries meaning. Whether or not the recording ever reached the public, the act of creating it signaled that Bing was willing to explore that risk privately. As months passed, the two maintained occasional correspondence, their friendship defined not by constant proximity, but by mutual respect. They did not reinvent their careers overnight. Both continued to fulfill commitments and deliver the performances audiences expected. Yet subtle shifts occurred. Bing occasionally included lesser-known spiritual songs in his set lists, framing them not as departures, but as personal favorites. Dean allowed moments of sincerity to surface within his otherwise lighthearted shows, sometimes speaking briefly about the music that had shaped him long before fame. These gestures were modest, and yet they reflected a deeper recalibration, a willingness to integrate rather than compartmentalize. Industry insiders noticed the change in tone, though few could articulate its origin. Some critics remarked that Bing's performances carried a new warmth, a hint of reflection that enriched familiar standards. Others observed that Dean's relaxed style now included moments of unexpected depth, as though beneath the effortless exterior lay a current of quiet conviction. Neither man publicly credited the December concert as a turning point, yet privately they understood its significance. It had not altered their careers in measurable metrics. It had altered their relationship with their own identities. Years later, when asked in interviews about defining moments, both men referenced that winter evening with understated gratitude. And they did not frame it as dramatic transformation, but as clarification. Clarification that success does not require the abandonment of one's origins. Clarification that audiences, far from demanding constant perfection, often appreciate glimpses of humanity. Clarification that courage in art is less about rebellion and more about sincerity. The memory of standing together before 18,000 people without the usual scaffolding of expectation remained vivid, not because it broke records or dominated headlines, but because it reaffirmed something essential, that music, at its core, is communication rather than performance. As the decades unfolded and the landscape of entertainment evolved, the lesson of that night continued to echo quietly in both men's lives. They navigated changing tastes, new collaborations, and the inevitable passage of time, yet the awareness gained from that shared vulnerability endured. When challenges arose, creative disagreements, personal doubts, shifting public opinion, they carried with them the understanding that authenticity provides an anchor no trend can replace. The dare had begun as a simple suggestion backstage, but it had become a compass, guiding them toward a balance between image and integrity. In retrospect, neither Bing nor Dean would claim that they had mastered the art of complete transparency. Fame has its own gravity, and public personas rarely dissolve entirely. But they learned that even within established roles, space exists for truth. The December concert at Madison Square Garden did not erase their crafted identities. It enriched them. It reminded two accomplished performers that beneath every carefully rehearsed note lies a voice shaped by childhood, struggle, belief, and longing. By acknowledging that voice openly, even briefly, they strengthened not only their connection to each other, but their connection to the audiences who sensed when something real was unfolding before them. The echo of that hymn, sung without orchestration and without artifice, lingered long after the stage lights dimmed. It echoed in studio sessions, in quiet hotel rooms between tours, in conversations with family members who noticed a gentler honesty. It echoed as a reminder that the bravest acts are often understated, that legends remain human beneath accolades, and that sometimes the most enduring legacy is not a chart-topping record, but a moment when two artists choose sincerity over safety. Time, as it always does, carried both men forward. Careers expanded, tastes shifted, new stars rose, and the world grew louder and faster. Yet beneath decades of recordings, tours, television appearances, and carefully managed public images, the memory of that winter night remained steady in the hearts of Bing Crosby and Dean Martin. It did not dominate headlines, nor did it become a marketed legend. Instead, it lived quietly within them as a reference point, a reminder of what happens when performance yields to truth. As the 1960s unfolded and the entertainment industry evolved, both men navigated changing audiences and shifting expectations. Bing, long established as a symbol of warmth and reliability, adapted with dignity, continuing to record and appear in special broadcasts that kept his voice familiar in American homes. Dean, embracing film, television, and music with his signature ease, became one of the defining entertainers of his era. To the public, their careers seemed distinct and independent. Yet privately, they remained connected by that shared understanding that artistry without honesty eventually feels hollow. There were moments, scattered across years, when each man revisited that lesson in his own way. Bing occasionally allowed himself to include more reflective material in his sets, songs that did not rely on festive cheer or polished perfection, but instead carried introspection. He did not announce these shifts as reinventions. They were subtle, almost private gestures within public performances. Audiences sensed a maturity deepening in his voice, a tenderness that suggested lived experience rather than rehearsed charm. And those who listened closely could hear that he was no longer merely delivering notes. He was inhabiting them. Dean, too, found himself drawn back to the music that shaped him long before fame. In quieter studio sessions, away from the pressure of chart expectations, he explored hymns and traditional songs with renewed appreciation. While not all of these recordings achieved commercial success, they carried personal significance. He no longer viewed such material as incompatible with his image. Instead, he began to understand that an image can expand when fed with authenticity. The fear that audiences would reject sincerity proved largely unfounded. Those who loved his light-hearted persona did not abandon him when he revealed depth. Many embraced it. Their occasional conversations over the years were rarely dramatic. And they spoke about families, about the industry's unpredictability, about the strange paradox of being widely known yet privately misunderstood. Yet woven through these exchanges was gratitude for the moment that had quietly altered their perspective. Neither framed it as transformation. They recognized that growth is gradual, not sudden. Still, the December concert served as a compass, gently correcting their course whenever ambition threatened to overshadow meaning. As the decades progressed and health began to weigh more heavily on them, reflections grew more frequent. Bing, nearing the later years of his life, often spoke of balance, of striving to honor both the public persona that sustained his career and the private man who once sang in church pews as a boy. He kept personal recordings, songs sung without the expectation of release, and as reminders of who he was beneath acclaim. He did not seek to dismantle the image that had defined him. Rather, he sought to humanize it. That subtle distinction shaped his final years. When Bing passed away in 1977, tributes poured in from across the world. He was remembered for his contributions to music and film, for the voice that had accompanied countless holidays and milestones. Among the many who reflected on his life, Dean carried a particular weight of memory. He attended memorial gatherings not as a celebrity fulfilling obligation, but as a friend honoring a shared journey. Those close to him later noted that when he spoke privately about Bing, he did not recount chart positions or accolades. He spoke about courage, the quiet kind displayed not in grand gestures, but in the willingness to be emotionally transparent before thousands. Years continued to unfold, and Dean himself eventually faced the closing chapter of his own life. In quieter moments, when asked what achievements mattered most, he rarely mentioned awards or television ratings. Instead, he spoke about integrity. He recalled standing in Madison Square Garden, voice trembling yet steady, and choosing to sing something that mattered personally rather than strategically. That memory did not outshine his career. It grounded it. It reminded him that the most meaningful success is not measured solely by applause, but by alignment between who you are and what you present to the world. The legacy of that night did not rest in recordings or preserved footage. It lived in stories passed between family members and friends, in the subtle shifts within performances that followed, in the understanding that legends remain human beneath reputation. The charity concert had raised substantial funds for children in need, fulfilling its practical purpose admirably. Yet its deeper impact unfolded quietly within two men who recognized that vulnerability, when offered sincerely, strengthens rather than weakens. For audiences who later heard the story, the lesson resonated beyond the context of celebrity. It illustrated that authenticity is not confined to grand stages, it applies to everyday life. The courage to share something personal, to step outside the comfort of expectation, to sing a metaphorical song that feels risky yet true, these acts create connections more enduring than perfection ever could. Bing and Dean did not abandon their public identities. They refined them by integrating truth. As history moved forward and new generations discovered their music, the deeper narrative endured alongside the familiar melodies. Behind the polished recordings stood two men who once dared each other to be honest. That dare did not dismantle careers, it enriched them. It affirmed that even within structured performances, space exists for sincerity. And perhaps most importantly, it demonstrated that when one person chooses vulnerability, it often grants others permission to do the same. The spotlight eventually dims for every performer, but the moments shaped by authenticity outlive the glare. The night Bing encouraged Dean to sing from his heart was not extraordinary because it defied convention, and it was extraordinary because it reaffirmed something timeless, that art is most powerful when it reflects genuine experience. In that sense, the hymn sung in Madison Square Garden became more than a song. It became a reminder that courage is contagious, that friendship can deepen through honesty, and that the most enduring legacies are built not only on talent, but on truth. And so, long after applause faded and stages were dismantled, the echo of that shared vulnerability remained. It whispered through decades of music and memory, reminding all who heard the story that authenticity is never out of season, and that sometimes the bravest performance is simply being yourself.